favor quirky and unpopular causes. So he's written on a deregulated economy, he's written on Curzonian foreign policy, he's written on Raj nostalgia, and he's a man who the right perceives as being on the left, the left perceives as being on the right perceives as a sort of oddity that they tolerate as a heretical nationalist. So Swapan, over to you to lead the discussion. Thanks very much.
Good evening, everyone. You know, we started this Republic Day function in the morning with a celebration of Kipling, and now it's sort of sundowner time in the old days. So it's the question of the sunset of on empire. Now, empire is an issue which, believe it or not, doesn't evoke too much of interest in Britain. It doesn't. I'm told it has absolutely no interest in Holland. But it's a very lively subject in India. Whether you see it purely in terms of India's heritage tourism, or you seeing as the favorite whipping boy for every ill in society, empire has left a tremendous impact on India. And I'm very, very glad that we've been able to muster together some of the best minds on the subject, people who've written extensively on it. David Gilmour, who's written an authoritative biography of certainly my favorite viceroy, the most superior George Nathaniel Curzon. We have Kwasi Kwarteng, who's a conservative member of parliament from one of the shires, if I'm not mistaken.
No, not a shire.
Not shire. Okay, he denies it. But he's written a book called The Ghosts of Empire, which, believe it or not, is not a spooky tale. It's really about the entire process of how the empire was perceived in the minds of those who ran it. There's Pavan Varma, who in his own way has, in this context, is very contrarian. He's written a book called Being Indian, which offended me because I came away with the conclusion I'm very Indian in that. Indictment of Becoming Indian. It's an indictment of the entire process of westernization which has affected India and particularly the Indian mind. And finally we have Ian Buruma, who has written on so many different subjects. Some of you may have, the cricket fans may have read his work on Ranji, his work on Occidentalism. He wrote this wonderful slim book called Murder in Amsterdam. He's written a book on wages of guilt, which, in case anybody of you are interested in Germany and Japan's, how they encountered defeat. And finally, he's written a book curiously entitled Voltaire's Coconuts. Coconuts, incidentally, is the pejorative term which is often used for people who are brown on the outside and white inside. A description which is often hurled at many Indians. Now, I think I'll start off with you, David. You know, when we talk about empire, we often talk about a concept. But more than a concept, I think we are always referring to certain institutions which the empire builders cherished. They believed they left a lasting legacy on the colonies and the dominions. Now, you've written this book called The Ruling Caste, which is really a study on the Indian civil service. Do you think that was one of its most enduring contributions?
Oh, yes, I certainly do. I'm glad you're mentioning, can you hear? I'm glad you're mentioning the institutions, because the normal response when people ask about the legacy of the British Empire, they point to cricket, the English language, these vast, often crumbling buildings of the law courts and government buildings. But I think there's much more acceptance now, I think here in India too, that there's an institutional connection. Sorry. All right. There's an institutional connection. I'm just reading a new book by one of India's finest modern historians, who makes a great point about the Indian civil service the steel frame that was one of British colonialism's unquestionable gains to free India. And then I also found a speech by the current Indian Prime Minister, Manmohan Singh, who recently said that today, with a balance of perspective offered by the passage of time and the benefit of hindsight, it is possible for an Indian Prime Minister to assert that India's experience with Britain had its beneficial consequences. Our notions of the rule of law, of a constitutional government, of a free press, of a professional civil service have all been fashioned in the crucible where an age-old civilization met the dominant empire of the day. These are all elements which we still value and cherish. Our judiciary, our legal system, our bureaucracy and our police are all great institutions derived from British Indian administration, and they've served the country well. And I think probably he should have added the army as well. But I do think, when I look back at the British Empire, all the good things and all the bad things, that probably the Indian civil service was the British Empire at its best. And I think this is proved by the fact that in 1947, the independent states of India and Pakistan both modeled themselves very closely on the ICS. And when I was doing research for that book, I was moved and interested to meet a lot of members of the Indian administrative service, men who happily told me that they were the IAS, they told me that they were proud successors of the ICS. So I think that is an institution one can be quite happy with.
Pavan, you were a member of the inherited version of the steel frame. You served as a diplomat in various countries. And does your experience correspond with David's assessment of the enduring contribution of the ICS?
Well, Swapan, my father was in the ICS, and I joined the Foreign Service and was a diplomat till 2 weeks ago when I resigned prematurely. The essential point is that there are pluses and minuses of the entire British legacy. But the book that I wrote, which is called Becoming Indian, The Unfinished Revolution of Culture and Identity, it dwells on the cultural legacy of colonialism. You see, colonization is not about the physical subjugation of the people. It is, as per its avowed and publicly stated mandate, of colonizing the mind of those whom they rule. And in this sense, there was never a more spectacular rule than that of the British. They proceeded to co-opt the elite of India in their own mold. Famous minute of Macaulay stated that that was their express purpose. They succeeded beyond their wildest expectation. And it's part of a conscious policy. When you rule a people, you must in some ways make them feel inferior. And if you read the entire corpus of British commentary on Indian culture, there were exceptions, I will grant. But if you read that corpus, it was to show that there are very few redeeming features in Indian culture, that the British were inherently superior and therefore meant to rule the natives. And therefore to derive from that it is important to co-opt an elite which is a mirror image of ourselves. And in that sense, it was a tremendously disruptive legacy in terms of its cultural impact. We haven't still recovered from it. When on 15th of August or Republic Day, on 15th of August 1947, the Union Jack went down and the tricolor came up, it ended a political phase. But please remember and interrogate yourself and introspect on it. In how many different ways the colonial legacy continues to have colonized the minds, in particular that of the elite. And there are specific examples of which perhaps, and if you give me a chance, I will elaborate on it later. The most spectacular example is language.
Kwasi, as a person of Ghanaian origin, who's settled down in Britain and risen to the top, almost I hope you reach to the top of the political ladder.
Hardly.
Well, somewhere in the middle rungs of the political ladder. Do you feel deracinated? Do you feel culturally uprooted?
I think that it's more complicated than that. I also think it's a generational thing. I think, if you forgive me, that question would have perhaps had more potency 30 years ago, 25 years ago. I think now people are quite happy with multiple identities. You have people who maybe have a European father, maybe an Asian mother or an African mother, and they grow up in lots of different countries. And I think given the nature of globalization, more people in the world are happier with lots of different identities. They can see themselves as British, but also they can see themselves as Muslim. They can see themselves as people coming from India, but also they have an affinity for Scotland. I mean, one of my colleagues in the Labour Party is a young MP for Glasgow, Anwar Sarwar, and his father was MP for the same seat. So there's no way in which someone like that, whose father represented the same seat in the British Parliament as he is currently doing, can feel deracinated in any powerful way. But I think people can sit more easily with lots of identities today than was the case in previous generations.
In a strange sort of way, Ian, you've written about how the idea of England appealed to the Dutch for a long time. I mean, that might sound a bit, I mean, they even took up cricket. Why do you think that was? What was the enduring attraction? The Dutch had its own empire, but yet they were fascinated by the idea of England.
Well, when you say the Dutch, I think that's a generalization. I think the idea of England, since more or less the end of the 19th century, appealed to the upper bourgeoisie in many European countries. And I think one explanation for it is that aristocracy, the upper class in countries like Germany, Austria, was almost a question of caste. You were born into it, you didn't get into it. Whereas in Britain, England, theoretically, you could become a gentleman through and become a member of the upper class through wit, education, connections, and so on. So you could have Benjamin Disraeli becoming Prime Minister of England, which wouldn't have been possible anywhere else in Europe. And so people who aspired to upper class manners and way of life and so on in other countries looked to England and the English gentleman and Englishness and so on as a kind of ideal. And of course the same is true in India. It's not a Dutch phenomenon so much as a fairly general phenomenon in the late imperial period.
Yeah, David, you know, Pavan has made the strong case that more than anything else, it was a colonialism of the mind. That British rule destroyed perhaps the soul of India. He didn't quite use those words, but I think it wouldn't be inaccurate. It wouldn't be an inaccurate logical extension. Yet, within the colonial administrators, they didn't perceive they were doing that. For example, Curzon spent a lot of his time actually restoring the history to the Indians. Sure. Do you find that there is a mismatch as to how the colonials perceived themselves, their role, and how they are perceived now?
But I think it's very difficult to generalize over a period when the British were here for quite such a long period. I think in the 18th century, your thesis doesn't actually work. There was a great acceptance of the British of Indian culture, especially in Bengal. And the thing about empires are a fact of history. They've been around more often than not over the last 2,500 years, and there's bound to be a colonization of the mind. When the Romans came to England, people started speaking Latin. I don't think that means that the whole of British history or culture, but subsequently has been badly damaged by it. And I don't see that this can be the case here.
What I wanted to also focus, I want you to focus on is the experience of India unique? You've studied the African experiences in Sudan, in Nigeria, elsewhere. Is it the same sort of experience, or was India a special case, the sort of proverbial jewel in the crown, which had its own trajectory?
I think if you look at British India and the British involvement in India, it was completely unique. in the sense that the length of time over which Britain was involved with India is very long and unprecedented. I mean, if you look at the 18th century, if you'd asked someone in 1750 where the heart of the British Empire was, they probably would have said Philadelphia. But of course, famously, the Americans declared independence. And yet India, all through that time, through the 17th century, through the East India Company, through the 18th century, through the 19th century, and only in the middle of the 20th century, had this very involved relationship with Britain. But I wanted to say something about Pavan's point in terms of the cultural destruction, if you like, or cultural imperialism. I think, and he mentioned Macaulay's Minute on Indian education, where essentially Macaulay was saying, we're not going to teach what he would call native languages, we're going to teach English, because all the science and knowledge in the world is in English, and there's nothing good in the native languages. I'm paraphrasing. But I think over time, Macaulay's own views, written in very lucid English, were challenged. And I remember reading David's book on Curzon, and Curzon refers, I think, to the chilling breath of Macaulay's rhetoric, because he was trying to move away from that early 19th century idea that English should be rammed down the throats of Indians. So there was, I think there was evolution to the imperial ideas on this subject.
No, actually, when Macaulay introduced that minute, there was tremendous opposition in Britain itself to the idea of completely replacing the Indian languages with English as a universal form of education. Because remember one thing, colonialism is not about intention. It is intention backed by military power. And that leads to the institutional setting up of the instruments that enable you to implement that intention. So all education became, if you wanted especially government service, the medium became English. And you gradually had a situation that even though Curzon later made that comment, it was too late, Swapan, to reverse the process. A certain process had set in which combined a curious paradox. First, in a sense, you have to be diffident, if not ashamed, about your own culture. As a result of what the British told you about your own culture, which you internalized through an institutional system of education. And secondly, you began to look upon their culture as superior in every respect. And that led to a process of colonization of the mind, and as I mentioned to you earlier, language. In India for a long time, and please don't reduce this to a mechanical simplicity. I am not against English, but I am against a nation of linguistic half-castes who are adrift from their mother tongue and are perpetually unsure in English. One of our former prime ministers made the comment that it is a myth that the British left India as a result of the freedom movement. They left because they could not bear anymore the massacre of the English language. They left. So you cannot create a situation in a country as linguistically rich as India of finally reducing a people who consider it, in a sense, a matter of status even to be more fluent in your own mother tongue and language. I mean, I will say this in Hindi, if you're traveling, or maybe say it in English for my panel. If you're traveling by Shatabdi and you speak to someone in Hindi, he will reply in English, lest you think he doesn't know English. So there is a prabhutva, there is a value attached to a language which is a direct legacy of colonialism. There is nothing wrong in teaching English. English is a global language. We need to learn a global language. But when children in nursery and KG somehow twist their native tongues to start parroting Baba Black Sheep, it's a national disaster, believe me. And we need today, 65 years after that, to introspect on it, to look at ourselves in the mirror and say, especially this swathe of urban India, the educated Indians, how closely affiliated are we to our culture? Because photocopies are a convenience. You have to be the original somewhere. And that's important.
Cultural half-castes, that's a very sort of loaded term.
Could I add something to this?
I just also wanted you to while you could answer or respond to Pavan's intervention, you also sort of studied the experiences of other European empires, the French, the Dutch, the short-lived German Empire. Were these sort of examples emulated elsewhere?
Well, I totally agree with you that the key to a successful empire is that you convince the natives that you are superior and therefore it's the right order to rule. Different European countries did it in different ways. The French did it by saying that French civilization was superior and people should assimilate. The British did it by creating upper classes in their own image. The Dutch did it much more because they were less aristocratic in a more racialist way. The Japanese did it in the late 19th, early 20th century by being the most modern and independent country of Asia and so on. But I think a lot, and I'll liven things up here by attacking one of my fellow panelists, or at least the ideas. I think it does also depend on how the people who are colonized saw themselves before being colonized. That's to say, when the Romans invaded Britain, the native population, who are of course not British, had barely risen from their knuckles, and Roman civilization really was superior. There was absolutely no question about that. One of the reasons that the Koreans resented so much the colonization by Japan is because Korea was an independent country and saw itself as culturally superior to the Japanese because they were closer to the Chinese metropole and so on. So I think that does make a difference. I mean, when you get a bunch of merchants from Europe who come to India, which had an ancient and very rich civilization, then it's a little difficult to accept that the ones who are colonizing you are superior and have the absolute right to do so. The fact that the British succeeded nonetheless is, the word tribute is perhaps a little strange, but is a tribute to imperial skill.
I think it's extraordinary, though. I mean, I want to take issue with what you've just said.
Good.
So what you're suggesting is that it's fine if the people are genuinely
I knew that was coming.
less civilized than... I mean, this is extraordinary. I mean, that would justify... If you thought the so-called Native American culture was manifestly inferior to the English culture, then it was perfectly justified for the English to go to North America and subjugate the Native Americans.
Yeah.
And that's essentially what you're
That's
saying.
an argument made by Neil Ferguson. I mean, almost in those words.
No, but I think it's a wrong argument. What do you think?
Yeah, no, I agree. I think that is the wrong argument.
So you don't think it's right for the Romans to come to Britain, then? You think that's fine?
I mean, it's a little late in the day to debate whether the Roman invasion of Britain was fine.
I just thought it was quite interesting, saying that because the Britons weren't as civilized in inverted commas.
I don't
that
think
made it better.
No, I don't think it's a question of good or bad or fine or not fine. I think one has to make distinctions in history as well as between in time as well as between the different kinds of empire. And to discuss it all as a sort of moral issue of good or bad is confusing. I think you have to see it in its historical context. And in some cases, there was something to be said for forms of colonialism. In other cases, there was much less to be said. So I think we have to make distinctions.
May I just make a point, Pavan, in response to your argument? You know, the British stayed longest in two presidencies, Bengal and what was called the Madras presidencies. If you look at it in contemporary terms, probably the most westernized of them were the Bengalis. After that came the Tamils. And yet these are two communities who are probably more sure about their language, about their culture. So is this notion of the cultural uprootedness predominantly a North Indian problem, which, like many things, is transferred to the rest of India?
First of all, let me join you in paying tribute to the British, because I'll come to you just now, sir. Because, you know, you are dealing with a culture that goes back 5,000 years. 600 years before the birth
Cultures, I think you should say.
Culture. A civilization which is a melting pot of many cultures, but yet defined Because, you know, infinite diversity is a colonial argument. Winston Churchill said that to say that India is a country is to say the equator is a country, which is really to prove that if we were not there, you would not be there, which is a complete lie. And I can give you examples after examples to show that when people in a confined geographical space travel on a historical journey for 5,000 years, there are such overlapping frameworks of civilization, which includes subculture. So let's be clear on that. But 600 years before the birth of Christ, when most civilizations or peoples had not come down from the trees, you had a man called Bharat. He wrote a treatise called Natya Shastra. That consists of 6,000 Sanskrit shlokas, which are not a description of the arts. They are a meditation on what constitutes aesthetics, rasa. A civilization of this kind to have been co-opted so successfully by the British in the space of 250 years deserves a tribute to the British. I often say that the only statue the British should have left behind in India was that of Macaulay, who succeeded. To come to your point, Swapan, it's a tribute to the Bengalis and the Tamils. Should you completely believe that in a sense that in spite of them being on the front line of the colonial assault, they've retained a great part of their cultural chastity. And I believe great parts of other parts of India also have. I am just defining what the colonial intent was, and the fact that you set up an institutional mechanism to achieve it, which succeeded beyond all wildest expectations.
Was there a colonial intent, David?
Well, not at the beginning.
Apart from making money.
Well, that was the incentive to start with, but there was no real colonial intent really until the 19th century. There's an entirely different view of imperial mission that comes in probably with Lord William Bentinck in the 1820s, and then there is the controversial campaigns against certain Indian practices, most famously sati, but also the Hindu Widow Remarriage Act that was promoted very much by some Indian reformers like the great Ram Mohan Roy, and was very much opposed by more Hindu conservatives. But there's a different impulse in different generations. I mean, the British Empire was spread over 6 continents over 300 years. It's not. They're not sitting in Whitehall planning. We're going to do this. Maybe on that Education Act there is, but there isn't. There's much less of a general thing. And we were talking about Kipling this morning. I mean, how much how much he opposed the missionaries, and how much, especially after 1858, there's very, very little effort, in fact, opposition among the British official class to any type of conversion, religious conversion, which is not what the Portuguese did.
Kwasi, you've argued in your book that there was never a central ideology to empire.
Yes.
That it was dictated by individuals acting according to what they saw were local compulsions, and according to perhaps guided by a certain cultural ethos which had been imbibed through the public schools, through the camaraderie of the universities, through a common background. So you two would go around and say that there was no real central intent.
Well, I go further than that. What I say in my book is that the culture was one of individualism. I mean, individualism, it wasn't just something that happened. Because someone said to me, oh, well, they didn't have the internet, so of course they had to rely on the man on the spot. But it's beyond that. It's something that they celebrated. And I just wanted to read a little bit of, very short, I promise, an extract about this, which was written by a man called Lord Cromer, who was the Governor General in Egypt. And he said, our habits of thought, our past history, and our national character all point in the direction of allowing individualism as wide a scope as possible. And he contrasts this to what he would perceive to be the French Empire, where people were looking to the center all the time. Now that might be a myth, but it was something that people felt very strongly about themselves, the British felt about themselves. And so individualism wasn't just a byproduct of the fact that this empire was spread over 300 years and spread over 6 continents. It was actually part of the philosophy by the late 19th century. And this is a time of social Darwinism, survival of the fittest. There's a lot going on in the mental space. This was an era in which individualism, as far as the British were concerned, should be given free scope. And that's why you had lots of these shifting ideas, which I think proves what David said. I don't think it was, there was a colonial intent.
Can I take issue?
Please.
I mean, but if that is so, several generations were trained in the British public school system to serve in an empire that modeled itself after Rome in many ways, which is not the same thing as teaching people they're all individuals and they
sorry, this is a very, I dare say, Marxist idea that everyone who went to the same class in the same school has exactly the same opinions. I mean, all of you, I take it, went to school. All your classmates would have radically different views. You'll have people on the extreme right that you probably went to school with. You'll have left-wing people you went to school with. You'll have atheists who you went to school with. You'll have very religious, devout people you went to school with. So you've got to translate some of the experience one has to history. Yes, it is true that they went to similar institutions, but the idea that these institutions just sort of turned out carbon copies who all thought the same thing about everything is completely false. And that's what I try and show in my book. There were atheists in the 19th century. There were social Darwinists. There were people who took their Methodism or their Catholicism very seriously. And there's no way you can predict how an individual, just by virtue of the fact that he went to Oxford or Harrow, wherever it might be, would react in a certain set of circumstances. And that's what I mean by the individualism. I think it's too easy to say, oh, well, they all went to the same public school, so they all would have acted in the same way. I think that's completely false.
No, it didn't produce.
No, I didn't. I'm putting words into your mouth, but
Yeah.
I hear that argument.
But then I should
I
be
hear
able to answer.
that argument all the time, and I think it's
No,
completely
you
false.
did put words
be
into my
careful.
mouth. I mean, the fact that not everybody turns out to have the same opinions, that's of course true. That's in human
Absolutely.
nature. But that doesn't mean that there weren't certain educational aims.
No,
from
I think
those
the
in
aims
these
were mainly
schools.
on character.
I'll tell you, in my
think
view,
they
Kwasi, see, since English is not my first language, I'll use a word which probably doesn't exist. We are microcosming the problem. In the sense that among the British there were philanderers and there were celibates.
Yeah.
So does that mean that they didn't have a common intent?
No, it mean, no.
I mean,
but-
it does mean that colonialism is a very serious project. Please don't treat it as ad hoc or random. And at least in terms of its impact on whom they rule, it's part of conscious policy. Let us not reduce it merely because in one class that go to the same school, somebody loves cricket or football.
No, that's not what I was saying.
I mean, I'm sorry, I'm
I think there are
maybe caricaturing.
radically different ideas
Now about
that
the
are
ideas, if I
being
could
pushed
respond to David.
by different people. They're radically different
I
Can I
ideas.
think the
respond
common
to
intent, surely there is a common intent, but that isn't administrative. That is the structure. It's not common
The
intent.
ideology, David.
No,
please understand.
no, I
ICS didn't
disagree.
have an ideology.
I'll tell you, let me explain to you. When the British first came, and that is the period you're, in a sense, lionizing, which the apologists of empire do all the time, there was a phase when the British, without being motivated strongly by the ideology of perpetuated colonial rule, when they were still in a nascent phase, when the empire had not consolidated, there was an initial phase when the British met Indian culture on near terms of equality. The Asia Society, the Asiatic Society, the White Nawabs, where, I mean, half the British residents, until a certain period, learned Farsi, learned Urdu. One of them was, in fact, a shair, a poet. They enjoyed that interaction of culture. But starting from the 1830s, when the philosophy of colonial rule consolidated itself as a result of the consolidation of the military notion of empire, there was a sea change. And if you read, I mean, I can cite to you examples after examples of then the conscious policy, perhaps not articulated as part of a note. Macaulay's minute came closest to that, was the denigration of the culture of the natives, the projection of the superiority of the colonizers. The tragedy is not what they did. They did it very successfully. The tragedy is that over a period of time, this was internalized in the psyche of a great majority of the natives. That legacy needs to be interrogated sometimes, I feel, even today. Because we cannot create mimic men. A great culture and civilization cannot create mimic men. It was the yardstick of excellence. That is the question which is far more serious.
I think, you know, behind all these fierce disagreement is the question of how the empire unraveled. Do you think our views, Ian, have been colored to a very large extent by the manner in which the entire process of decolonization post-1945, that happened, the mess which accompanied it?
Well, Niraj Chowdhury, of course, had an explanation for the end of empire, which was the end of British Empire. There was sheer funk, that the British lost their nerve. And you could say the same thing about the Soviet Empire. I mean, that there were no objective reasons why the Soviet Empire needed to have folded as it did. But once you don't believe yourself anymore in the enterprise you're supporting, it will unravel fast. And I think, and I would ask Kwasi this question, if there was no ideological content at all, what did Kipling mean by the white man's burden, for example?
I think
and if you feel, if once that idea becomes unfashionable, and the British themselves don't really believe in the white man's burden anymore, yes, then it will, if you don't believe in your own cause, you're not going to convince the people you're colonizing that it's right either, and it will unravel fast.
I think there were lots of reasons. I mean, the white man's burden was essentially an issue about the rule of law, and I would say, if you call the rule of law an ideology, that was one thread that they did believe in. But if you look at the way India was administered, you've mentioned this before, there were lots of different variations. There were lots of local variations. It was incredibly varied, the way in which administration was applied. And there was a much greater plurality than we can imagine in terms of the different regions, in terms of the different priorities. One thing I would say about 1945, yes, there was funk, but there was also a very crucial reason, and this I will put on a sort of Marxist analysis. Britain had run out of money in 1945. Britain was bust in 1945. In fact, the worst deficits that we ever had weren't now, they were in 1945. The Labour government had absolutely no money as a consequence of the war. I'm not making a party political point, I'm just saying the country had no money. There was no appetite.
I think we need to give some credit to Mahatma Gandhi also.
No, absolutely. There were other forces, but in terms of the lack of will, there was also a lack of resource, even if they had the will, and that was why my view is that's why the empire disintegrated so quickly after 1945.
But it was the manner of its disintegration, I think, which has been called into question, which has clouded subsequent opinions of the empire as an institution that was worthwhile upholding. You know, everywhere there was a mess. I mean, India was, of course, the supreme mess. But in your book, you pointed out various places where Sudan was a mess, Nigeria was a mess, Ghana was probably relatively okay.
Yes.
Yeah. But Burma was a mess.
Sure.
So was it that process more than anything else that you've involved yourself in a project, but when you leave it, to use Gandhi's words, you left it to God and anarchy?
Well, I mean, just a quick point on that. Someone said that it took Britain 300 years to establish itself in India, roughly, and they left in 70 days. Okay, we quibble about the actual, but in terms of the scale of time and involvement and the quickness of departure, it was absolutely extraordinary. And that, I think, as Gandhi said, led to anarchy and God.
But of course, I mean, half the empire didn't disintegrate to a mess, and we often forget the importance of the dominions, which had been much more successful. In the British consciousness in the 19th century, the fact is that India actually wasn't the most important component of the empire. Disraeli's thing about being the jewel of the crown was a clever phrase. But in the second half of the 19th century, 1 million British people emigrated to Australia and New Zealand. Another 1 million went to Canada and South Africa. 3 million, most of them Irish, went to the United States. In 1900, when Queen Victoria died, there were only 156,000 people, British people, in India, half of which was the army. So the idea
that's because we were not white. Let's call the truth of the
British Empire.
I mean, it's a color. You see, the other factor about colonialism, Swapan, is the migration. The migration, the people stayed on. There were lovers of India who stayed on, who became a part of our fabric, whom we greatly respect. But migration to Australia, to New Zealand, to Canada becomes much easier. Sure. If you take into account the fact of color.
We've got a short time because we've got to also let the audience have some say in this. But as a sort of parting shot, you know, entire views on empire has been colored by one gentleman called Edward Said, who has actually questioned the basic right of the white man, so to say, to write and pass, pronounce judgment, to study it, to actually preach to the natives what empire was all about. This may be a crude caricature of what he actually wrote, but that seems to be that the prevailing feeling amongst certain people that, look, you can't really discuss empire with the former colonizers. There is nothing in common for us to discuss. We have our experience, they have their experience, and never the twain shall meet.
I think that's not fair. I agree.
I mean, who's not being fair?
No. Always not you. The point I'm making is that when two forces interact for 2.5 centuries, there is bound to be areas where each have benefited from each other. Let's take a sane view on these things. But the extremes, where you say we gain nothing from the British, or to say that the empire was essential for India, and I've read books which come very close to saying that. This is wrong. Today, there's no acrimony. 65 years after independence, we should have the objectivity to calmly analyze what have been the consequences and see them in our own lives on a daily basis. And that, I think, is what needs to be done in the 21st.
But that doesn't quite address Edward Said's point that you cannot write, that a white person cannot
No, what
write.
Edward Said did was, if I may correct your somewhat simplistic interpretation, what Edward did was to say that they have written, and some of them have done very scholarly work. But it is important for those about whom it is being written to have the perception, the discrimination, the knowledge and the research to try and understand the bias very often with which they are written. What is the subterranean intent or the motive that prompts that kind of image that they have of you? So that, I think, is a valid scholarly exercise.
The tragedy, of course, is that history is one of the most under-researched things in India. I think Al-Biruni said in the 11th century that Hindus have no sense of history. I think he may not have been very widely off the mark. But Kwasi, what about your feelings?
We've got a lot of racial stereotyping flying around here. And in modern Britain, I think a lot of these comments will be taken to task. I mean, someone referred to the half-caste culture, which is an extraordinary thing to say for a modern politician. And we talk about mixed race, and actually, we think it's probably quite good to have a mixture. People are very comfortable with mixtures, as I was suggesting earlier. I think this notion that because people have a white skin or because they come from a certain area, then they cannot pronounce on any subject is absurd. And I have read Said, and you're right to say that he was more sophisticated than that. What he was trying to say was that we should be very conscious of where people are coming from. But to that, I would say, just because someone comes from a certain ethnicity or a certain background doesn't mean that you can predict what they're going to say. I mean, if you look at the Marxist critiques of empire, most of which are very savage and very damning of empire, most of these critiques, I'm afraid to say, are by white Europeans, or a lot of the effective ones. And not most, but a large number of the effective ones. And so you can never predict, just by mere virtue of the fact where someone has come from, what exactly it is they're going to say.
I'm afraid I agree with him.
You need not apologize.
But it's similar to my individualism point. It's a similar point.
I think there's lots of questions. I mean, this has been a very, very stimulating and provocative discussion, and I can see lots of it. Let me ask the person right towards the end. Yeah, a hand.
Can't see anyone.
Please keep it succinct, and it should be a question, preferably, and not a tirade.
And indicate to whom?
Given that for many Indians colonialism is a living memory, and that Britain locked up freedom fighters who are still alive today, when Britain's Prime Minister visits India next month, should he apologise to them and for Britain having colonised India?
Can I say, there's a tremendous trend now, people should apologise for everything. I think people should apologise for what they are responsible for, and not what they had no say in. And my view is that Tony Blair ought to apologise for Iraq, but not apologise for the massacre of Amritsar.
No, behind you, the lady. Yeah.
Very well.
My question is directed to Mr. Pavan Varma. As a professor of English literature, this is a lived reality for me. You know, the kind of inferiority that has been accepted and internalized. Because it was only in 1999 that the University of Delhi changed its syllabus to incorporate the Indian writings. But my question is, can we really discard the idea that it has also bred the kind of cultural chauvinism that we see? Because we, more often than not, we come to hear that a lot of fantastic writings are ignored, and some very average writers in the vernacular languages, in Hindi or any other languages, they get the highest Academy awards. The Sahitya Akademi prizes. So where is the balance? I mean, what is your opinion on that? On one hand, we are interpreting Kalidas in terms of Shakespeare, and on one hand, there is this cultural chauvinism that we are trying, you know, tooth and claws to kind of reinstate, whether it merits or not.
You see, the polarity is on both sides. Very often, very mediocre writing in English gets a pan-Indian audience. And exceptionally talented writers in your own languages languish for lack of recognition. Look at the most influential book reviews. Look at the very, very prominent writers in our languages and ask a certain class for whom English has become the first language if they even know them by their name. So it cuts both ways. About the question of valorizing mediocrity in languages, it's a process of evolution. There can be a situation where you begin to rectify the balance, that the balance goes a little to the extreme. It will correct itself. But the fundamental bunyad, the essential point is, we must begin to genuinely give respect to our languages. That is the fundamental point.
But for that disrespect, we cannot blame David Cameron.
I want to ask Mr. Varma, why have you not been able to move on after 65 years? Why are you still stuck with what the British did?
I'll tell you why.
No, let me finish, please. The other thing I'd like to ask Mr. Varma is, why do you write in English?
Good point.
Why don't you set an example?
I would answer both. And I want to say to you, I would be happy to move on. I would be happy to move on, except that there are traces, in fact, sometimes far more than traces of the colonial legacy which persist, and which, in the bathos of political freedom, have not been sufficiently analyzed. Nations which are 65 years old as republics need to do that. So I believe the project is valid. Why do I write in English? First of all, let me say, partly I write and speak in English because a lot of people, perhaps including you, may not understand what I'm saying if I were to speak cliched Hindi, which I can do very easily, and we can have a separate session on it. That is not the issue. The issue is that we who are the victims of colonialism are perhaps, the victim is the last to know. My parents removed me very early from a Hindi medium school and put me into St. Columbus, from where I went to St. Xavier, from where I went to St. Stephen's. I could have become a saint. And this process of gradually English replacing your own mother tongue as your first language happens. The important thing is that I was aware that I need to come back to my language and made the effort. My first book is a biography of Mirza Ghalib, for which I learned Urdu, which should be my inheritance from where I come.
As my friend Manishankar Iyer used to say, why blame the college?
My question is for Mr. Varma. It relates to...
Well, can we have a certain diversity? I mean, let's also ask the baddies some questions.
After my question, please. So it relates to whether the colonization of the mind in India still continues, and I'm still dwelling on the role of the English language here. I believe that even thinking of it as a colonial language, I think it's gone past that expiry date.
Absolutely
and
right.
English is my language. I grew up with it, and I consider it my first language. I don't see it any more foreign than anything else. So I don't see why we should even think of it as a colonial language and not see it as our own. I mean, the English can go back and say it's a Germanic language coming from the tribes from Germany and the Netherlands or wherever it came from,
Quite
evolved. So how far back do we go in this globalized environment?
You see,
Absolutely.
the way I see it is that I have no argument against English as a language which is a language of great relevance as a global language. I am putting to you a proposition which I don't expect you to agree with me, and that proposition is as follows. There is a difference between a language of communication and a language of culture. A mother tongue becomes ultimately a window to your folk tales, to your lullabies, to the sap of your soil, to your history, to your tradition, to your culture. And a language of communication is an enabling language which you could be in love with, fully respect as I do, but the two are not substitutable. Somewhere what has happened in the project of modern India is that a great part of the educated elite has begun to adopt the language of communication as their mother tongue. I believe there is a distortion here which we can correct, where we can continue the importance of both.
I think.
Can we just move away from Pavan for a minute? He's really a...
Well, can I comment on that a little bit?
Look, this is an absolutely fundamental issue, and I have a totally different view from Pavan. I think, and I think actually, if I may say so, that you have a very old-fashioned view of language and culture. I mean, today, people, they go on the internet, they spend a huge amount of time on YouTube. I went to Egypt, I saw a man, he spoke perfect Californian English. And I said, how did you learn this? He said, oh, I just watch YouTube, I just listen to music. He'd never actually been to America. And he was as comfortable with this language, he thought in this language, even more so than Arabic. Now, to say that he's somehow denuded or deracinated, I think is incredibly patronizing. This is someone who is a modern guy, he's a 24-year-old, he's completely integrated into his own culture and has assimilated a global language. And to say that, oh, English is a language of global relevance, I think it completely misunderstands the forces which are driving the modern
But
world.
also a language that is innate, as a tool of communication, can become a native tongue. I mean, 200 years ago, most people in France didn't speak French. No. So that would, what you're suggesting is that somebody from Brittany or Auvergne, to get to the sap of the soil and other rather old-fashioned phrases, would have to write in Auvergnat or in Breton and not in French. Because I think that would come as great news to those people.
I'll tell you my answer in response to you. Because the answer is, why is this dilemma faced by me? Why
because you made it into a problem.
Because I tell you, I have a longer memory than you. I have a longer memory and I choose not to forget. And it's time to also remember as much as it is to reconcile. History, a Russian historian says those who don't remember the past are plain stupid. You've got to remember the linkages between the past and the present. This civilization to which we belong, and there's no chauvinism and xenophobia here, was not born yesterday. We are legatees of a great culture, a remarkable culture, so we must interrogate very often how closely integrated we are with that culture, how much we are spokesmen, and how much, even if you keep repeating that old-fashioned word, deracinated. how deracinated or the other we are. Words are not old-fashioned.
I said it was old-fashioned, but you
Ideas
asked
become
me.
old-fashioned. And the point I'm making is, why doesn't this dilemma ever confront Britain? That the top elite of Britain starts speaking Bhojpuri. Why doesn't this confront you?
Can we have hands of those who don't want to ask Pavan Varma? The lady there. Oh, God.
No,
I'm really being nepotistic. That's right.
I want to ask David a question. He said in 1935, Britain was very poor at that point.
45.
How come? I mean, was the poorest in history at that point.
That was me. Sorry,
I
that
think
was
it
my
was Kwasi who said that.
All right.
And I
Question
think
is
also
to you
he
then.
said 1945, after the war.
Okay,
45.
Yes, sorry, 1945. But why do you say that? Because when the British came to India, 36 to 40% of the international trade
24%.
was with India and only 2% with Britain. And when they left India, about 40% of the world trade was in British hands and only 2% in Indian hands.
I think you put the question in terms of the bilateral trade.
Not just bilateral trade, just international trade.
International trade.
And money related to it.
International, but in 1945, the country had fought a war for 6 years, in which public spending had obviously gone through the roof, and John Maynard Keynes had to go to Washington to negotiate a loan of $3.5 billion sterling to keep the country afloat. Britain financially in 1945 was bankrupt, and this is historically not very disputed. And the point I was trying to make was that even if they had wished to sustain the empire, they simply didn't have the resources. The British government simply did not have the resources to do so. And that was why, very interestingly, when independence happened in India in 1947, it's only 2 years after the end of the Second World War, in the House of Commons, there was very little opposition to it, because people realized, even Winston Churchill, who in the 1930s had been thundering about India and how India should stay as part of the British Empire, by 1947, there simply wasn't any pushback, because they saw how poor and how strapped for cash the country was, and how limited its ability to sustain an empire actually was.
And how strong the freedom movement
Yeah,
was.
absolutely, absolutely.
Javed Bhai once.
Sorry, I mean...
It doesn't answer my question.
I think we leave it at
the
that.
empire gave them money. Why did they need money to sustain the empire? The empire gave them money. They took a lot of money from India. They were not spending on us. They were taking away our money.
Never mind.
Javed.
Javed sir.
Shall we go back to the language?
I mean, they don't think about Second World War. I mean,
Yeah, no, but also the Constitution developed in 1935. It wasn't
Well, you know, I believe that language is not only a vehicle for communication, but this is the vehicle that carries culture, identity. If you cut a person from the language, you are cutting the person from a culture, from the roots. So it's not a matter of either or all. I feel that the discussion is whether English is important or the vernacular language is important.
Both are important.
Both are equally important. It's a great language. It is a kind of a bridge between us and the rest of the world. But at the same time, we have to be rooted too. So can't we have a system where a child starts learning English
Mother tongue.
from the first standard, but the education is in the mother tongue. And after 7th standard or 8th standard, English becomes a medium of education, and for at least 2 to 3 years, mother tongue is a compulsory subject.
In fact, you know, if I may answer Javed Bhai, it's a perfectly valid suggestion, because all modern research shows that if your initial years you are grounded in your mother tongue, you pick up a foreign language better and faster. So at least the English language will be less massacred in India. That's one thing.
Maybe that gentleman there who's been waving desperately.
Yeah. Hi. I was wondering what if one looks at the other side of independence in the Indian context, and if the panelists have any thoughts on whether being a colony, whether we learned some of the lessons or we didn't, because I can give one example from what I know of the Andaman Islands where I do some work. In the 60s, there was a Government of India document which talked of the islands, of the natives of the islands, and the forests of these islands is infested by the natives. And 40 and 50 years down the line, the development that was, for instance, initiated in those islands, so whether we've become in a sense colonizers as well as the Indian nation state and the ambition of the Indian nation state in the territory but also internally.
Anyone in particular? I think that was an intervention. I mean, the last question, maybe the gentleman. Yeah, please. Absolutely the last question. I'm sorry, but I know lots of people have. But
it's a very quick question. It's the 150th birth anniversary of Swami Vivekananda. So I just wanted to ask a quick question as to whether, and I'm not going into the details, but how indirectly or directly has the colonial legacy influenced the way in which we look at our religion, in which we have looked at our social movements, and not only the language, because I think that was what being debated most.
It's got to be Pavan.
Well,
okay. I don't want to be the only one answering.
No. I mean, you want me to answer?
Yep.
Yes, you should answer.
You could answer, yes.
Yeah.
No, I think it has, but I think it's not really the empire or colonialism which has distorted our perspectives on what constitutes religion and religious thought. I think it's far more modern values of a very spurious form of cosmopolitanism which sometimes has affected it, and that postdates the empire. I don't think it's that. If you look at what the perceptions of India were.
On a panel. Sorry.
What rude remark did you have to say?
Nothing. I was talking.
He's talking on the phone.
As active.
Anyway, to get back, it's really the problems are really post 1947. If you look at the literature of the period till 1947 and what the mainstream of Indian thought was, it's so markedly different from what it is now, or at least what is fashionable to articulate. I just want to wind up this the whole thing. The other day, we've heard the stories about the East India Company, a sort of a letterhead company, which has been taken over by the Indians in Britain. Some Indians have bought over that. And during one of the fracas which was going on earlier this evening about imagined slights to people, someone suggested we should immediately send a telegram to the East India Company, Mother India ill, please come soon. I think on that very sort of despondent note, I must say, thank you very much, everybody. I think it was a very, very spirited discussion.
Good.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much to all of you. I do want to say that David Gilmour and Kwasi Kwarteng will be signing books. If you want to meet with them and get your books signed, they'll be at the book signing area. And thanks again for ending this day so wonderfully. I must bring to your attention that the